Why don't we just make one circle, one sort of semicircle, and Steve, just turn me down a tiny bit so I don't sound so massive in the space. Great to see you. So the purpose of these little seminars is hopefully just to equip the saints for what we're trying to do in the world, and also hopefully give you guys a better understanding of your sort of emotional health in context. I think we're going to record this, aren't we? So, is this streamed live, Steve, or what are we doing with this? Sorry, we're live. Okay. Well, hello to anyone who happens to be watching online. Welcome to you too. I hope this is helpful for you. Why don't I pray, and then we'll get into this, and I promise we're going to be done by past, so just to set expectations. Jesus, thank you that you care for our emotional and mental health as well as our spiritual health, and we want to pray now, Lord, you would just open our eyes to see what you're saying and what you're doing, and Lord, whatever's helpful and good for our souls, we pray that we would take it on board, but anything else we pray would fall to the ground. So we just pray now you would open our hearts and minds to hear you speaking, in Jesus' name. Amen. I guess we have got a little bit obsessed in my mind about winning the battle. So we get really focused in work about achievement and what we need to win and how we're going to get there. And that forward focusedness is really helpful on one level, but also quite de-energizing on another. So if you're in the room, the likelihood is that the appeal of a title like Retreat to Advance, it's the advance bit that is interesting to you and not so much the retreat bit. So normally people who are interested in advancing come to a talk entitled Retreat to Advance rather than people who are interested in retreating, because people who are interested in retreating obviously wouldn't come to talk with advance in the actual title. So what you find is that actually, hopefully with this talk I've found over the years, I'm speaking to people who are one level ambitious and motivated and are mobilized for change, but they want to know actually how can I do this really well. I also find that when I'm talking about this topic, which I've spent quite a few years teaching on, that I'm often talking to people who've had an experience of not being able to advance because of some sort of adversity in their life. It might be a physical health condition, it might be a mental health condition, it might be a learning difficulty, it might be a relationship challenge, it might be something to do with a work experience they've had in the past. But largely we'll be a group of people here who think, yeah, you know what, actually I really want to advance, and I've tried to advance, but there's been some things which I felt have come against me. So I want to just acknowledge that and say that, that's great. It's great that we're here. It's great we're thinking of advancing. It's also important that we are empathetic to ourselves and one another in the way we're thinking and acting, because we're all carrying different sorts of burden for this. But I sometimes fear that we've, as Christian leaders with ambition, we've exchanged activity of the kingdom with, for relationship with the king of the kingdom. That actually, within the context of the Christian life, we become very, very sort of quite driven and quite achievement-focused and orientated. And there's lots of great things about that, but sometimes at the expense of a personal relationship with Jesus. And I got an awful lot of trouble at New Wine probably about 10 years ago now, because I did a main stage talk called I think I used something like driven is the language of the devil or something like that, which didn't go down particularly well. And my whole talk is a bit of a famous New Wine talk, because my whole talk was looking at how we'd accommodated this language of drive within the auspices of the church, when actually in the New Testament the word driven is only used in the context of driving out demons or driving out people who were unclean or happened to be defiling the temple courts. And obviously it didn't go particularly well with Rick Warren's whole purpose-driven life thing. And it also particularly didn't go very well with one massive church that were there, which was called the Purpose-Driven Church. And they actually organised to see me in the leaders' lounge to kind of argue with me about why the language of drive was actually okay. I was saying, is this a marketing campaign because you're worried about the expense of changing your name? The language of calling is the language of Scripture, not the language of driving. That actually, ultimately, the language of calling is the truth that God has already gone before us and is calling us into being. He's calling us into the land. He's calling us into the fullness. He's calling us into the promise because he's already there. And I think this is a key thing for us as leaders who maybe have ambition, is to recognize that God's not instrumentalizing us to fulfill his ambition for the world. God is calling us into an ambition that he's already realized for the world. And I found this to be really, really helpful for me personally in leadership, because I'm actually quite scared. I get quite scared. I get quite anxious. And I think, oh my goodness, this is really too much, for someone like me. And the language of drive says, well, I'm actually, we do a colour profile here, which I'm learning a specific colour profile, and I'm a sort of primarily green, but quite yellow. That means I'm not really a drive person. And in the sort of leadership language that I understand better, I'm a poet, I'm not a warrior. And so I look around at other warriors who are like driving on into the land. I'm thinking, oh, I'll stay at the back and write poetry and write stuff and kind of reflect on stuff, because it doesn't work with my nature. But I also know God hasn't called me just to sit still. He's not called me to kind of sit back and say, well, that's for other people. And that's why the language of calling is so important to you, that God is calling you into a space that he already inhabits. So part of the way I've managed my anxiety in life is to, rather than think about going into a room where I'm the pioneer, where I'm trying to break the ground, I'm going to a space where God, my Heavenly Father, is already present and is calling me into participation. He's calling me into a space that he already inhabits. So for me, the empty space is not empty, because the empty space is merely about me coming home. So that's a framing exercise I'd love you to think about when you think about what it means to advance, that actually we're stepping into a space that God already inhabits. And that has a huge implication for your confidence in spaces like interviews, because rather than seeing this as a hostile environment where you might get found out to be a fraud, it's a space already that the Lord already inhabits, and you're looking at him saying, do you really want me to do this or not? And let this process be a process by which I might be discerned for rightness or wrongness, but I know that you're in the room. I remember doing that when I literally had the most terrible imposter syndrome going into the Church of England, and I felt the Lord call me in a very, very supernatural and charismatic way, and yet in the actual process of it all, which is quite litigious, I remember thinking, there's no way I'm going to get through this. And that was the language I was using at the time, get through this, as if I could trick my way through it. And I felt that that's when the Lord started talking to me about this idea of actually, if I want you to do this, I'm going to open every door, and if I've opened every door, I want you to know that's enough for you to know that I want you to do this. And that's been a really helpful thing for me, because in moments of doubt, you're going, well, Lord, you opened every door, so this isn't a mistake. Ultimately, I don't know where the course of my ministry will go, but I know that this isn't a mistake. And for you too, to know that where the Lord is, he's called you into that space, and he's calling you on into new spaces, and that is part of your kind of key DNA for growth. I do quite a lot of random research in my life. I don't know why, but I've got this brain to kind of pick up things, and I call them factoids. I'm not sure if you've heard that phrase before, but sometimes I wish my brain would just do a factoid dump, just to kind of eradicate all of the factoids of my mind. But what it does do is it kind of pulls up little things and little moments, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's interesting. This week it was that 61% of American pleasure boats sink at the dock or on the mooring, versus 31% that actually sink when they're underway, which will probably come out in a sermon at some point soon. But I want just to introduce you to this, Steve, if we could, this slide about Everest. So Jordan Light, who was writing in the Scientific American, which is a great kind of journal online I sometimes look at, he said that they studied Everest, ascents on Everest, and there's quite a lot now, so there's quite a lot of data to really work through. And what Jordan Light concluded after looking at this study particularly was that climbers who died after scaling higher than 8,000 meters, that's 26,000 feet above sea level, of that number of climbers, 56% died on the way down, but only 15 died on the way up. Now, the mathematicians here are going, those numbers don't add up. And they don't add up because the other 17% of people died either when sort of turning back or by accident or injury in a particular camp. So they were neither on the way up nor on the way down. They turned around on the way up, or they they stopped at a camp, if you see what I mean. But the people who were uniformly walking up the mountain, 15% of them died. But those who got to the top were the risk group, because 56% of the people who got to the top then died. So in terms of the volume of people who died on Everest, you're more likely to die if you make it to the top than you are if you don't get to the top, which is quite a frightening statistic when you think about it. And I've played with that idea for quite a long time, this principle in life that actually when we achieve a dream, we're in a great place of vulnerability and risk. So once we've achieved an ambition, then we're really vulnerable. I've never met a climber who said, I'm training to climb down Everest. But actually that would be far more sensible. It would be far better to say, I'm training to climb down Everest, than it would be saying, I'm training to climb up Everest, because actually really climbing up Everest is not that hard, but getting down again, that's the bit that's really challenging. If you actually speak to genuine climbers, and I'm not one, they always say the descent is tougher than the ascent. But that doesn't make any sense to me, because you're walking downhill. But actually it turns out that having your back to the mountain is very, very dangerous. You're very vulnerable because you've got nothing to hold on to directly. That actually having your back to the mountain, is a challenge because you're on your heels rather than on your toes. When you're climbing up a mountain, you're leaning in with ice picks and you're kind of onto the mountain and you can arrest a fall quickly. But when you're back to the mountain, you have to turn around to arrest your fall. And actually, you're not plugged in. You're not connected deeply. When you're climbing, being roped to another climber is appealing. It feels secure, but there's nothing like being roped to the mountain. That's really secure. I think in life, again, we can kind of connect to other people who are on an ascent, but the key thing for us as Christians is being roped into the mountain, actually being deeply connected and recognizing that we have this great vulnerability when we get to the top. And that leads me, Steve, to say that ultimately success generates stresses that make us vulnerable to failure. And this is a key part for you all in terms of thinking about your emotional health in leadership or whatever sphere of influence you're engaged with, that actually success is not, if you like, the gateway to further success that we might imagine it to be. Success actually generates particular stresses that make us vulnerable to failure. I'm always careful with myself that I'm not like creating mantras that just serve me. It's like I'm going to create some great phrase which will legitimize the way I live my life. And then I'll go, hey, someone once said success generates stresses that make you vulnerable to failure. That's a great saying. I should live by that. Oh, I do. I made it up. But I genuinely have noticed, and increasingly over the last 18 months specifically, how successful leaders are falling like flies. And in the last book I had published, which was The Power of Belonging, I wrote a half a chapter about people who had what I call priori belonging. These were people who had such a rich and deep sense of their identity in Jesus that they lived like they belonged and therefore didn't attempt to kind of conform for the sake of being accepted by the group. And one of those people was Jean Vanier, who's sort of a lifelong hero of mine because of the way in which he loved on people who society had rejected. Now, sort of a year from the point of publishing that, it suddenly turns out that Jean Vanier has not been loving on people without some personal benefit or gain, and sadly, a reputation, and I don't believe his whole reputation, but certainly his reputation in part has been severely damaged as a result. And that proves, again, something about the fact that success generates stresses that make us vulnerable to failure. And we've seen this across the board with Hillsong's leadership and within the Anglican Church and within safeguarding environments and within issues around embezzlement of finances and control and power. And it's not just the church, it's the world at large. But people say, oh, how the great have fallen. Well, have the great fallen because they're just unlucky? Or is there something about greatness that makes us vulnerable to falling? Or is it just that when you're great, everyone's looking at you falling? Now, I'd love you just to take a couple of minutes just to buzz with the people around you about this idea. How does success generate stresses that make us vulnerable to failure? In your own life, when have you felt vulnerable when you maybe achieved something or got somewhere where you'd hoped to be, or maybe came to the end of a process which you've been working on for quite some time. So maybe you just want to double up or triple up with someone around you. Just spend a few minutes asking a question about this. Is it true? Is it true in your experience? Okay, let's come back together. Let's hear back from a few of you about maybe some themes or maybe just words or themes that come to mind around this topic. Anything, just shout out. Anything, any thoughts? Come on, please, it's open. Yeah. So that's really helpful, thank you, Laura. So your support network changes, or people begin to celebrate you rather than support you. So there's kind of challenges there about what's around you in success. Yeah, anything? Yeah. So there's situational vulnerability, character vulnerability, but we could say that situational vulnerability is an extension of character vulnerability, and there's a lack of awareness about what it feels like when we are successful, and therefore we can become blasé, we can become pragmatic, we can stop caring We can start riding on our successes in a way which makes us vulnerable to character failure. But as I say, materially, if we've scored, there's an oppositional vulnerability because we've become a target. So success in the media often means you become a target to trolls, or if you're a success on the sporting field and you score a goal, you're a target to an opposition defender. So often fouls occur against successful players. The more successful the player, the higher number of fouls. You could say the success of the player is a demonstration of their skill, which means that they're fouled because no one can really beat them, or you could just say they're just a target of people's aggression because they happen to be scoring one way or another. It works out that way. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Andy.
In aviation, for pilots, there are no milestones where people become more vulnerable, whereas you gain more experience, so typically hundreds of hours of experience. So the first one is 500 hours,
Right.
and then people will, because you kind of forget that you are human, you've achieved some stuff, oh, this is good, I can do this now. The next 500 is 1,000, and the same thing happens. Instead of, in aviation, our culture is very much about we all make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. So we learn to be human. Whereas when you get to these milestones, and other people say, oh, you got 3,000 hours. Oh, that's cool. I'm at 2,990 at the minute. So, no, it's true. You start to feel, you forget your humanity.
Brilliant. Andy, you've just logged another factoid in my head, and my next sermon will be about the 500 hours that is necessary to retain your focus. This is really helpful for us to think about this, because in a way what Andy's just illustrated is this idea about vulnerability and risk. And those people at greatest risk of failure after success are those people with the least self-awareness and effectively the least disclosed vulnerability. So the higher up the hill you get, the less willing you are to be vulnerable, because actually you feel the scrutiny and the necessity to be better than you really are. And also the less accountable you'll be held, because people's esteem of you changes, and if you like, they edit out the struggles you're having. I remember teaching quite a big conference, mental health conference, and at the time I was talking directly about anxiety and about my own struggles with an anxiety disorder, and I like to think that I communicated reasonably well in the setting, but I don't get stirred up by big sort of settings particularly. I'm just doing my job. But I was doing my job with confidence and hopefully delivering with clarity. And a woman came up to me at the very end, extremely angry with me. And I remember just sort of standing almost behind the lectern. And when you've done a talk, you feel a bit vulnerable anyway, but you're kind of hoping that people will come up and say really nice things. She says, why won't you just accept it? And I was like, accept what? That you're totally fine. I was like, okay. She said, clearly you're absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with you. You clearly haven't got an anxiety problem, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do that. And I was going, okay. Like, how do I deal with this right now? So all the alarm bells are going off in my head. But she was really irritated and annoyed because she wanted to sort of reconcile her vision for what mental health looked like with the way I was delivering a talk. She thought, oh, this can't possibly, it can't possibly be true that you could have a problem and also be able to communicate effectively. And I felt that was fascinating. Her estimation of me in position was, you're successful, just because I can string a few words together. But for me, I have an anxiety disorder. So I was like, well, this is what I do, this is what I manage day to day. Doing this doesn't actually hurt me that much. There are other things that do hurt me, but this isn't one of them. But it was just a real wake-up call to the fact that we, in positions of perceived success, are then at risk of, if you like, enabling or colluding with ideas that we're someone that we're not. And I want to kind of move that into this idea that actually this is a biblical precedent. Now, you might be thinking, oh, but I'm not sure how this applies to my life. But it's hold on to what I was saying at the very beginning around that idea of the Lord calling you into the room. Because this is really about confidence. And what real confidence really means. And I want you all to kind of walk away tonight with a little bit more confidence in God's call over your life. And that's why this can be helpful for you. Steve, if we just move on, let's just show this little illustration. Sorry, it doesn't fit particularly well on this screen. So here are three special heroes from the Bible. The first one's Gideon, and he had a victory, as you know, over the Midianites. And it's remarkable, that thousands of Midianites were defeated by just 300 men and Gideon. Gideon's story is the story of vulnerability. When he first came to sort of break down the altar to Baal, he was saying, "I'm the least of all my descendants." Don't bother me. I'm just a scared. He was hiding on the threshing room floor, desperate to sort of avoid being noticed. And there's a sort of angel of the Lord there saying, "No, you're going to be the leader of the people." And he's like, "No, not me. How could this possibly be?" But having then defeated the Midianites, Gideon creates a gold cloak out of basically the nose rings. I think the Midianites used to wear like big nose rings. And so he creates this ephod out of the nose rings of the Midianites, which is basically a coat. It's pretty gross, but it's like a gold coat. Imagine chainmail, but it's all gold. And he's wearing this thing initially, and then he hangs it up to basically everyone to come and bring some sort of worship to his ephod. And in Judges 8:27, it simply says, "And it became a snare to Gideon and his family." No one preaches about Gideon's life. It's like one of those stories that it's like at EastEnders that it never finishes. There's just like this bad character who was once good but just sort of disappeared into ignorantly. Because we love the story, we just talk about Gideon's good old days. But no one ever talks about like the demise of Gideon, just that it's a bad one. And then you've got Saul, and Saul defeated the massive Amalekite army against all the odds. Amazing. But then he refuses to follow God's instruction from the prophet Samuel about how to distribute the kind of goods and how to manage the slaves and how to deal with the aftermath of the victory. And in 1 Samuel 15:35, this has got to be the most scathing sort of phrase that the Lord's ever used in the entirety of Scripture. It says, "The Lord repented that he'd made Saul king of Israel." We just think about that. I'm not even sure that's theologically possible, that the Lord could repent of his own action. But that's how bad it is. The Lord turned around from his own decision to make Saul king. And then you've got David and the Ammonites. Remember, he spots Bathsheba on the rooftops, and then he sleeps with her, and he has Uriah the Hittite, her husband, effectively killed in battle through surreptitiously pulling back and leaving him exposed, and that leads to kind of years of anguish for David. And in 2 Samuel 11:27 it says, "But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord." Now, I just want to sort of show this as an illustration of the vulnerability that we have as Christian leaders in whatever sphere we're operating. That actually, being a Christian is no protection against this sort of vulnerability. But actually, we're called to live differently, we're called to live better, and we're called to this awareness of success, which can enable us to really live and lead effectively and well for the long term. And I think, as someone who sort of sometimes struggles a bit, in some ways it's easier to be a struggler than it is to be a successful person to whom things have come easily. Because I'm a struggler, I feel like I'm roped into the mountain. I've got my ice axes. I'm kind of like, it's hard work. I kind of know what I'm doing. I'm trying to get on with it. But if it all came easy, I wonder if I would like unclip, throw my ice axes away and just kind of like, hey, come on, let's climb the mountain. This is all right. This is easy. So on one level, I'm grateful for it, but I want us all to be aware of it. Holmes and Ray, who wrote this scale in 1969 called the Holmes and Ray Scale, they basically said if you spend a certain amount of life change units within an 18-month period, they could predict whether you were going to have a nervous breakdown or not. Now, if you spend less than 150 points, you've got a very low estimated chance. Between 150 and 300 points, you've got a 50% chance of a nervous breakdown within 18 months, and over 300 life change units in an 18-month period, and you actually have an 80% probability of breakdown. This scale is still used effectively today as a predictive scale, and doctors often ask you subtly about Holmes and Ray, but they don't actually say who it is and what it's about. Which is, has anything major been going on in your life in the last, year or so? To which you surreptitiously sort of respond, no, not an awful lot. So-and-so died and went bankrupt and lost a house, and my wife left me, and got a terrible disease, and they're immediately clocking up the points in their heads going, okay, I think we're going to need to do something right now. Now, interestingly, Holmes and Ray identified the fact that it wasn't just negative things that cost us, it was positive things That marriage costs 50 life change units, reconciliation costs 45, work change is 36, high achievement 28. Imagine coming up to the front of the altar and saying, this is going to cost me a lot of life change units, I hope you're worth it. Actually, marriage is stressful. Relationships are stressful, success is stressful, and that's why I call it stress. That actually, if we're not equipped to manage ourselves in the context of fast living, which involves lots of achieving, then we're putting ourselves at risk. So thinking about success, what I want you to do tonight is to kind of think about what you really want and how you're going to get there, managing yourself in a way that's really healthy. Because as I said at the beginning, I feel like we're so success-centric as a culture. We're so blind to the vulnerabilities that success present. We're actually at great risk. And I increasingly believe that success is about sustained leadership, not about achievement-orientated leadership. I'm interested not in what you're doing now or even in 5 years' time. I'm interested in what you're going to be doing in 20 years' time or 25 years' time. My old vicar, who himself had a massive crash in ministry and had to leave ministry for some time, said to me, if the devil can't stop you doing what he doesn't want you to do, he'll get you to do too much of it. And interestingly, his own story of relational affair was borne out precisely along those terms, despite having warned me and others about the same reality. That if the devil gets you to do too much of it, you'll neglect your family, you'll neglect your marriage, you'll neglect your health, you'll neglect your mental health, and actually the whole house might fall down. So even people who carry a warning are at risk of their own warning. What's it look like to retreat, to advance? Steve, if we could just move on a couple of slides. Sorry, that's the stress. That's a new word for you to bank. If it feels good, but it feels challenging, it's stress. And actually, Brits particularly terrified about this sort of thing. Like, oh my goodness, that's like you're turning something positive into a negative, or this whole idea we should be kind of grateful all the time for everything. Thank you so much. So pleased to be here. It's wonderful. And actually missing out, like, oh yeah, this is really good, but it's also really costly. Let's really be real. Let's pop on to the next slide, where we've not got a huge amount of time. So I want you to think about stress relating to success as either being productive stress or destructive strain. And if you remember doing Hooke's law in physics, you put weights on a spring. There's two ways of proving Hooke's law. One was that you put too heavy a weight on the spring, and it would just break. The second one was that you put the right load on the spring, but for too long, and then you left it in the lab overnight. It came in the next morning, the spring would be on the floor, and you take the weight off, and it would just be a really long spring. It lost its springiness. Now, most people prove Hooke's law not by putting too great a weight on the spring, but by putting the right amount of weight on, but for too long a period. And the interesting thing about productive stress is you can be extended, but as long as you unload, the spring will return to its original shape. The key thing is how long are you extended for? And most people find that success is quite addictive. That actually when they're advancing, they feel like, people say terrible things like, we're on a roll. We should carry on. It's like, people, like, I'm winning. I'm on a winning streak. Like, a winning streak only ends one way, and that's the losing streak. Like, it's pretty obvious what happens, Like, if it's a full house, you're going to go bust pretty soon. So let's think about the idea of actually productive stress being something that oscillates between extension and load and unload and contraction. And this is the difference between productive stress and destructive strain. Destructive strain is always too much, too long, too far, too big. Dealing with your own self-management is recognizing you've got the ability to be really extended, but also you need space to be really contracted. The weird thing about this is it's a bit like bodybuilding. You can lift ridiculously heavy weights for 10 reps, takes 10 seconds of rest, and then lift exactly the same number of reps again of an equally heavy load. But try and press out 11 reps of the same weight without a 10-second break. Just can't do it. All you need is to advance and then retreat in order to regain your strength. It only takes an equal amount of retreat to your extension of advance to regain your strength. Think about it in this terms, Steve, if we get out that performance graph. This is a classic chestnut, the old performance graph here. But effectively, this shows you the stress levels on the x-axis, the performance on the y-axis. Underload is really stressful. If you work with anyone who's unemployed, it's really stressful. It's not relaxing at all. Optimum stress takes you effectively to the very top of the mountain. You can be extremely stressed. There's no beyond optimum stress. There's no like even more stressed. There's just like the top level of stress. You can get there, but as long as you don't stay there for too long, you can come back down the mountain. The key question is, how long are you going to be stressed? So look at the apex of the graph and you see that fatigue and exhaustion begin when you've stayed at the top too long. The same is true for Everest or any 8,000 meter mountain. Above 8,000 meters is just simply called the death zone because your body starts eating itself over 8,000 meters. You can't manage the low pressure oxygen at that level. So you can't gain enough breath. Only 30% of the oxygen at sea level is available over 8,000 meters. Only 30%. So you're trying to breathe with only 30% of the available oxygen in the atmosphere. And that's exactly what it's like when we're succeeding. And there's all sorts of oxygen that we're not breathing. Most of it is about common sense. It's like, just like on a mountain, when we're starved and hypoxic, we are losing our way with what we're trying to achieve, and we become disorientated to how we might live, and therefore we find ourselves struggling. Now, I want to ask you just to think about a few very simple things. I'm not sure we've got a massive amount of time, so we're going to just, if we could just go on, Steve, to the next slide. I just want to whistle through some really practical things that are going to help you think about how to apply this in your life from now. The first one is the opportunities myth. So when you're thinking about succeeding, as we said, opportunities are part of our addiction to achieve more. And as Christians, we can sometimes think that God has opened the door, when actually God hasn't opened that particular door, because we haven't applied any discernment to the door that's open. So, as I said to God, if you open every door, then I'm in, therefore it's all good, that's what you want. That's slightly different to the every opportunity is a good opportunity mentality. And when we're on a roll for success, it feels like every door should be a door that we should take. And it's really born out of the insecurity of saying, I think someone's going to find me out. I think someone's going to, this is going to end. But actually the confidence of knowing who you are in Christ and accepting that you're a child of God and He's got plans for you means you don't need to take every opportunity. That actually every opportunity is not necessarily the opportunity at the right time. And that's okay. The second thing is that you can never get enough affirmation. Many people chase success because actually they want everyone to say, oh, you're amazing. I've met and I've coached some people who are amazing but don't believe they're amazing at all. They're full of success, and no amount of success makes them feel affirmed appropriately. In fact, the more successful you are, the more insecure you become, typically. So the more, if you like, in the public arena you are. And so don't chase success for the sake of affirmation. It's a trap. You'll only feel less affirmed, more vulnerable, and more insecure. Thirdly, lists are not the way to find success. I know I'm going to court controversy here, because some people, don't attack my lists. I went through a phase, I did an emotional experiment in my last place of work, where I decided I would live by my own mentality, and I'd rip up all lists, and I would just not live with lists, and I would trust my brain to remember what was important. I did it for a month. What was amazing was, it worked. It worked perfect. No, it worked perfectly for me. Because I remembered everything that was actually important to me. Brilliant. The problem was I didn't remember everything that was important to everyone else. So I lived really happily for a month, but I upset a lot of people in that same month. We tend to remember the things that are really important to us, but we don't remember the things that are really important to other people. The trouble with lists is they confuse the language, they confuse the narrative. And lists can make us remember what's important to other people to the detriment of what we need to remember about ourselves. We don't write lists so other people can live well. We write lists so we can live well. And actually what we need to remember is the list is not our taskmaster, we are masters of our lists. And therefore success needs to not be the list journey, it needs to be the discerned journey. What's it look like for me to do this today? Fifthly, some people will just never like you. That's just great wisdom. And it doesn't change with success. Not that I know that much about success, but when I get there, I'll tell you. Some people just won't like you. And it's one of the greatest gifts to accept that in your life. Accept it now, it's brilliant. It's one of the greatest pieces of wisdom. I wish I'd known it when I was at school. It would have saved me a whole lot of heartache. Because some people, no matter what you do, no matter how nice you are, no matter how hard you try, no matter what you achieve, in fact, inversely to what you achieve, will just not like you. And that's okay. If you just accept that, you can live free and stop being beholden to winning in order that people start to like you. And I've met so many people who say, I know if I was just successful, people would like me. And now I say, if you're successful, you'll have lots of superficial friends who pretend to like you until you're not successful anymore, and then they'll leave you. They're like, oh, wow, that's a really depressing view of the world, thanks. But it's true. You know, success doesn't find you friends. It finds you acquaintances. And actually, some people will just never like you, and that's okay. And finally, you can unlock your own disciplines. You know, actually, you need to find disciplines in this journey of life which will support you both to retreat and to advance. And some of those disciplines are saying no. Some of those disciplines will be saying yes. Some of those disciplines are about working out the resources you have available to be able to extend yourself beyond where you are now. But actually, all of those come from you. And the greatest power you have within you, aside from the power of the Spirit of God, is your ability to discern that for yourself. To say, actually, you know what, that's a really nice invitation, but I just haven't got the resources to match your kind offer to do X, Y, or Z. One of the really great learnings I've experienced in the Minor Soul Foundation is that I cannot, must not, and should not say yes to every invitation to trek around the country. And I found that most of all when I was invited to go and speak at a Christian women's meeting in the Cotswolds when I was vicar of a church in Harrow. And I remember being invited, and I remember, oh, that's so nice. And a Wednesday night in the Cotswolds, that's really going to be great. And I remember the kids were young, and it was a complete sort of meltdown at the dinner table, and we were having sort of early tea about 5:30, and I was supposed to be there at sort of, 7:30 or 8 o'clock. And I got the kids, finished the tea, and left Lou probably crying because it was all such a bomb site. But oh no, I'm going off on a virtuous venture into the Cotswolds to speak to a big women's meeting about mental health. It's really important that I do this. I remember the car overheating on the M4 on my way there and needing to sort of pour water into the radiator to try and cool it down. And then I arrived in this small village in the middle of nowhere, and I found this church hall, and I kind of went in, went in expecting my speaker entourage. No one greeted me. I thought, oh, that's very quiet. And then someone said, oh, are you the speaker? I said, yeah. Who are you? I said, oh, well, I'm Will Vander. I mean, I never heard of you. Oh, okay. And they gave me a sort of cup of tea, and I'd had sort of kids' tea, and I thought maybe there'd be some sort of speaker snacks. And then I said there was a lot of notices. And then there was kind of a worship leader, and then there was the worship leader who gave the talk. And then it was kind of like, oh, my time slot's kind of disappeared, And then they said, oh, yeah, we've got a guy here who's going to say a few words about mental health. I was like, oh, okay. I did have a presentation, just a few words about mental health, and that was about 10 minutes I had. And then, so thank you so much. Thank you for coming. We're going to go back into worship now. I think this is all really important. Thank you so much. Thank you. All the best. And that was it. Got back in my car, drove another 2.5 hours back to Harrow, and I thought, wow, the Lord has taught me something tonight, is that I'm really getting far too big for my boots. That I think that actually my life is orientated around speaking opportunities, that I can't say no. This was like the most humbling experience of my speaking life, that these people couldn't care who I was. They couldn't give a stuff that I'd driven for 2 hours and 45 minutes, or that I'd broken down on the side of the M4. They didn't think about feeding me, they didn't know me, they didn't really want me there. And actually, at home, I've left a couple of people who really need me. If we let our image of ourselves escape ourselves, we'll lose ourselves. And we have to be sort of rooted in that idea of what success look like. What's life really, really all about, and how am I going to get there? I just want to share this final slide with you before we close tonight. I'm sorry we haven't had more time for some discussion, but this is the reach slide. Steve, if you could just put this up. So I want you to think about this idea of extending yourself into success, and I want you to use the reach acrostic every time you make a decision. The first one is reflect. Like, what is it that I'm actually being asked to do here? in the context of my life? Like what is before me? What am I actually reaching for? Like, what's the purpose of this? And ask yourself vulnerably, am I reaching because actually I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm feeling ignored, I'm feeling less than? Secondly, it's about an empathetic spirit. And sometimes, again, we struggle with this to ourselves. It's looking at the whole context of your life, of your family, of your circumstances, and go, if I'm reaching for this, is this emotionally good news? And actually, how am I doing right now? Is this good news for me? Is it good news for my family? Is it actually something that is emotionally beneficial? Thirdly, acknowledge the cost, because success is not free. Achievement is not free. Doesn't mean it's not something we should go for, but it's just not free. And we often try and bury cost. Oh yeah, and I've done this with Tim. Oh no, it's going to be really good. I did this filming thing, and I was like, oh, it'll be fine. Actually, it was a whole day of me slogging my guts out and preaching 6 sermons back to back. And I turned up at St Dionis Day quite soon after arriving here, and he said I looked like a ghost. He said, you look absolutely knackered. I was like, oh no, I'm fine. But what I was trying to do was bury the cost. It's not free. Not free to you, not free to me, not free to him, not free to us, not free to our team. Everyone is paying. But they want to pay. Is it right to pay? Celebrate. Celebrate both what you're reaching for, but also where you're already at. I always think, if success begets success in any measure, it's because you're celebrating your circumstances you're already in. But also you're celebrating an opportunity that might bring new joy. But if you're not celebrating your now, you won't celebrate your then. People will think, oh, when I get there, I'm going to have a great time. But if they're not having a great time, within reason, in this setting, they're not having a great time in that setting. I meet people all the time who bounce one job to the next job, to the next job, to the next job. They're going, oh, when I get there, it's going to be amazing. I'm going to feel great. If you're not celebrating here, you're not going to be celebrating there. You're the common denominator in your own experience. So if you're not rinsing every ounce of joy out of the now, then you're not going to rinse every moment of the joy out of there. If you're not celebrating, if your culture isn't to celebrate, then ultimately there's no celebration at any end of the rainbow. And finally, honor. Now, I of all things, I think, keeping your ego, not killing your ego, because that means killing your self-honor, but keeping your ego in check is about honoring God and honoring the people who love you in a priority over your ambition. So ultimately, if you're honoring God and you're honoring the people who love you as a priority over your own ambition, then you'll nearly always ask important questions about why you're doing what you're doing. Look, but when you honor yourself over God and you honor yourself over the people who love you, your ambition will always run away with you and ultimately it becomes unhealthy. It's ultimately a bad diet. So every time you reach or you're preparing to reach, reflect, empathize, acknowledge, celebrate, and honor. And you're well set to make a great decision. Guys, I've stolen 5 more minutes of your time than I hoped, but are there any questions? I know there's quite a lot there. I've just dumped a whole lot of thoughts. But are there any questions that you'd like to ask now? If there are, I'm going to hang around for another 10 or 15 minutes so we can chat. But that's it for tonight. A few little tidbits. You don't need to clap. Thank you. I receive it. And have a really great rest of your evening, whatever you're doing. And again, we can talk more.